Excerpts Satie. It's not a background music like himself proclaimed by saying it's furniture music. His irony, his tenderness, his poetry, his distance, his humor with the changing times, which scared so many and continue to scare it today with the changing times too, very many. Art forms, photography and film versus paintings and portraits, conquests and enormous amount of casualties for all kinds of isms that ideologized and in fact from the French Revolution onwards in France created a sense of doubting the authority. And then came the factual situation of the revival of this movement for healthier life, which led to the reinitiation of the Olympic Games by Baron de Coubertin, and bicycles and people exercising the cult of the healthy body, corpore sano in mens sano, was something that Excerpts Satie looked upon with a lot of irony by writing slow gymnastic gestures with the Gymnopédies, by writing musical sketches with drawings by famous illustrators about the different modern ways of society at the time, for at least the rich, who could afford all these leisures, which was a new concept also in society then. Everything was noisier and faster and louder between train and planes, and of course militarization on top. And I think that the approach of Satie also against the academics of French art and music art mostly. I mean, when you think about it, Saint-Saëns and Franck and Fauré and Charles Gounod and so many. The Rome Prize, the organists, the traditions, the clergy, the separation of church and state, which happened in 1904, the education, which was no more church-related, but was in the sphere of the public domain, and therefore all kinds of fundamental ways of fairness, unfairness to women, to minorities, racism, colonialism, international exhibits, electricity, changing everything in the work place. Of course, one can make parallels with the globalization and the computerization of society and the way services and industries function and produce today compared to before. So it's an ongoing process where the mentalities inevitably are the last ones to move after technology or ideology, and sometimes combined, pull society either by economic interests, either by ideological interests, and of course not to mention world population growth, which inevitably all this in the mix must have been puzzling for the people who are largely 19th century born people, obviously in the 20th century. And I find it incredibly profound that Excerpts Satie was sort of like the poet who was describing all this nonsense. There was nonsense poems, there was anarchy against rule, there was cubism to replace paintings that represented what you saw, but what you imagined you saw, the psychology of things. Psychotherapy arrived also at the same time. And all these different ways of thinking the human, thinking life, of course, medical progress as well as old-fashioned fears and grips of things that were lost by those who held on them. And I think that it's no surprise that iconoclastic Claude Achille Debussy was very much convinced by the artistic endeavor of Éric Satie in its poetry for orchestrating two of his gymnopédies. And of course, Satie making fun of the society, wanting to be cleaner, healthier, faster, more productive, more competitive, which were with the leisure and the entertainment, all these foreign concepts to all these men and women of the 19th century, where everything was more like the 18th century. And the way things exploded in their novelty frightened most of the people. And I find that this kind of distantiated and ironic second-degree humor observation with poetry and distance of society by, in fact, very poor Éric Satie, who was not part of any establishment in terms of intellectual organization or school or university or conservatory or any kind of philosophic movement, let less political. He was sort of a loner with an amused eye at Dadaism, at Cubism, and at all these attempts to display the nonsense of what's happening, while some things are great and some other things, even novelties, became clearly unhuman or non-humane, which is probably what most people feel today when you face the future of artificial intelligence compared to what we did until now. So I understand, and I don't know if there is a Satie of today who can sort of put in perspective with humor and literal poetry all these really angsts of the modern times, every time being its own modernity, but nevertheless the environment and the situation with how we relate to others is not a new thing. I mean, racism, colonialism was in fact from all times, unfortunately. Empires also, and fears and ruling by fear. And anyway, the education, the interpretation of the meaning of life, finitude, fear of finitude, and moral grounds, and societal judgmental ways for people who had different ways of living their lives. I think in the sports and leisure cycle, Debussy liked in Satie having such freedom, where he wrote his own sketches and had famous illustrators from fashion magazines illustrate the different isms of the day. Of course, communism, fascism, militarism on the dark side, and then all the entertainment and of course, the invention of film, and not to mention the leisure time that was taken, of course, mostly by those who could afford it, naturally, as usual. But the very concepts were, in fact, invented. So it was airplane and train, and everything was noisier and faster, and in a way, scarier while attractive. And I feel like escaping most people's grasp, since most couldn't afford any of it. And so how can they have an opinion about it? It's easy for us 100 years later to observe the movement of all these things and observe and say, this is because of these events that followed or this event that preceded. And this was how the world was then and what demography was, and etc. But I still think that the stand-up comedian style of ironic poetry in Satie's music, slow motioning, the energizing gymnastics, the health, and the paradox of getting healthier in order to get more killed in the inevitable race to arms that was happening, with territorial disputes as good excuses to continue on it. And of course that drives also the creativity, unfortunately, of engineers through armament. And so in a way he's very disarmed, Eric Satie. He only has poetry and melodic line and purposely simplistic harmonies that seem almost incongruous. I mean, they don't make sense. In a way they seem like a bad harmony exercise by a lazy student who doesn't care so much about how to organize neatly the voice leading. In other words, the complete opposites of Bach's polyphony, complexity, beauty, idealization of societal organization through voice leadings in a polyphonic world. I think he was more into rejecting all these beauty by complexity, or rejecting tonalism through another order, which would be the serialism, as Schoenberg did for the second, what we call today Viennese school. So he was probably not modal, no more tonal, not yet serial or ever. And on the other hand, his music then gains a sense of timelessness. It's almost like as if he stays still in the middle of a storm that took the 19th century into the 20th, industrialization, and changed the mentality and the meaning of life, let less of death, with the cruelty of the wars to come, besides the ones which already had happened. And at the same time, the price we put in essential, intimate feelings like love, care, hope, desire, obviously, a form of culture that comes from traditions, but traditions are with their pluses and their minuses, and of course traditions are also occasions to frame the other into what you would think is the right way forward and modern way forward. What was modern yesterday is old-fashioned today, right? And like the dissonances of yesterday are the consonances of tomorrow, as my teacher said too, for modernity. Of course you have people who strive through the modernity because somehow they hear it like Stravinsky and Debussy before it happened. They freed themselves from the academics of music making, learning, composing, writing, and Stravinsky and Prokofiev and onwards, and of course the Viennese school, as I mentioned. Satie seems to be sort of like timeless in his own time, very lonely, very far away from all these isms, Dadaism, as I said earlier, and Cubism, and all these movements of artistic way of describing, in fact, all these societal changes which were frightening and perhaps for some very exciting. But for most misunderstood and most possibly threatened, scared. And I find that this distanciation that he had with his own time, by ironically portraying gymnastics lazily, adds to a certain way of looking at things which I think today might be missed. Perhaps things are way too accelerated to be observed idle. Perhaps things move way too fast in ways that they already did compared to their own past. But I think Debussy recognized, and even Poulenc, who was younger, recognized the value of the work, of the oeuvre. John Cage did too, even later, of Satie's approach, Satie's musical approach, Satie's, if you want, aesthetic approach. To give and put too much meaning into his endeavor is probably even not being Satian. I think the nonsense by itself was a chaos, and I think he wouldn't have perhaps appreciated people dwelling like me 100 years later on the philosophy of the how and the why and the when. I think he also had trouble surviving his time period mostly, and physically speaking, as well as intellectually, not to mention emotionally. But I think he was a loner and an observer. I think his music, especially the Gymnopédies, is so ecstatic. It's just observing. It's not in action. The action happens and he reflects it through his music. It's like a filter of the live's situation. And he looks at it in return with a melodic line and a harmonic progression, quasi-barless, rhythmicless, thematicless, formless, provocative in titles more than in the content, in fact, of his, frozen embryos, bureaucratic sonatina, gymnopédies, and other Gnossiennes. I think we attach sometimes too much importance, in my humble opinion, to the provocative titles compared to the content of the music itself, which, by the way, it's way more poetic than the titles would suggest in their ideological content, if you want, or inspiration. I think in a way, his titles overwhelm the music, and if you listen to his music without the titles, I think you'll get closer to the poetry that I mentioned I detect, and of course not only me, in his music, and the simplicity being the beauty, not the complexity of, let's say, polyphony that reigned and still did in his time with the Ron Prize competition for composition, which was to write a cantata, a vocal fugue, and then a choral and piano piece. So everything is to do with complexity of polyphony, and his music doesn't go into there at all. It's sort of like idealized laziness, or apparently so. Provocative gaucherie. And I think what is beautiful, in fact, through the century that has passed since these early 20s of the 20th century, today in the 20s of the 21st, is that it gains an incredible, out of time, out of context, necessity, aesthetic presence in the musical world of today. It's not just an atonalism option or a nationalism option or a serialism option or whichever other musical language exploration was attempted in the 20th century besides folkloric, jazz, national, one way or the other. You reach a point where with Satie's music, you're a little bit out of time, not only because of the barlessness.